Planet Health, which is an organization, thank you, JJ, um, which is an organization focused on sustainability and pension fund investments. And then secondly, we'll be hearing from Paul Martin, who is principal of Spitfire Research and also co-founder of the Hydrogen Science Coalition, which is a coalition of scientists and academics and researchers who look specifically at the role of hydrogen in decarbonization strategies, particularly in terms of both economic and technological viability. So we're going to hear from Adam first, and then we'll hear from Paul, and then we'll have some time for question and answer at the end. Thank you. So Adam, do you want to go into a screen share mode?
Yeah, sounds good. Just give me one moment. Everybody can see that okay? Great. So thanks, Mark, and thanks for SEI for having us today. So as mentioned, I'm Adam Scott. I'm the executive director of a finance and climate advocacy project called SHIFT. And our team is focused on aligning Canada's financial sector with science-based climate goals. So most of our attention in climate spaces is often on policy, but it's often overlooked that many of the most important and consequential climate decisions are actually made behind closed boardroom doors of finance institutions and companies. So at SHIFT, we focus our work on helping members of Canada's 11 largest and most influential financial institutions, which are our pension funds, which collectively manage more than $2.4 trillion in our retirement savings on behalf of millions of Canadians, to engage their funds to act on climate. And that means setting and meeting science-based goals for how they invest their portfolios. And we do this for two major reasons. First, shifting these multi-trillion capital flows out of the causes of the climate crisis and into solutions is essential for stabilizing our climate. But we also do this because it's the smart financial move for the funds and their members to ensure that younger generations alive today will actually be able to collect a healthy pension and retire into a livable world 2050 and beyond. So if you're 25 years old today and you're paying into Canada Pension Plan, Canada's largest pension fund, you won't retire until 2065. So you can see how solving the climate crisis and planning for your retirement are sort of interconnected in that way. At SHIFT, we spend a lot of our time talking about how the unprecedented scope and scale of financial risks from the climate crisis are existential for long-term investors like pension funds and for society. But most financial professionals tend to focus more on the physical climate risks. So, floods, fires, heat waves, droughts, and the impact on real estate or infrastructure. So there really is a serious blind spot that still exists for this other major source of climate-related financial risk, which is transition risk. And as we all know, solving the climate crisis requires an energy transition, which is a systemic change to stop using fossil fuels in our energy systems. This transition is well underway already, and I think many aren't fully aware of just how far and fast this transition is already moving and what the implications will be for huge parts of the global economy. So economic sectors reliant on selling fossil fuels are really in deep trouble as the world transitions. And we refer to transition exposed investments as potential stranded assets. So the good news is we're seeing pensions and other investors starting to factor these sorts of risks into their investment strategies. I'll note we are starting to see fund managers are limiting their investments linked to coal. And in recent years, we've started to see some fund managers moving to back away from oil production investments as well. In particular, Quebec's major pension manager, the Caisse de dépôt placement de Québec, the CDPQ, has now fully divested more than $4 billion from its oil investments to avoid contributing to the climate crisis, but also limiting its exposure to stranded assets. And we do see other pensions divesting and screening for oil investments, but largely without announcing it publicly. But for most funds, we really started to notice this worrying trend of major investors remaining heavily invested in gas infrastructure, as if gas was somehow different from the other forms of fossil fuels. Traditionally, pensions have loved owning these big, safe, regulated monopoly infrastructure companies. And as transition risks have grown in recent years, And as these sort of risks become more apparent to the market, gas utilities have worked really hard to calm investor concerns and to downplay their obvious exposure to this stranded asset risk by talking up their plans to repurpose their infrastructure for transporting hydrogen instead of gas and allowing their businesses to keep operating. And you've likely heard some of this hype from the gas industry here in Canada. And we're consistently being told that gas investment is somehow cleaner, lower carbon, and required for energy security, and that some magical transition to using hydrogen across our economy will allow existing gas infrastructure to remain viable and profitable in the long term. And this just isn't true when you look closely. So at Shift, we wanted to sound the alarm and to show how our climate, as well as billions of dollars in pension savings, are really directly at risk because of this hydrogen hype that's picking up. And we researched and wrote a new report, which we released just last January, called Gaslighting the Energy Transition, to try to pull all of these sort of complicated pieces together into one accessible place. So forgive me for bringing this conversation over to talking about pensions when we're really trying to talk about transition, but they do link together quite well. Internally, we call this report the Hydrogen Report because it's clear that the hydrogen hype is core to the logic that investors are using to justify continuing to hold on to these gas utility investments. So I'll quickly walk you through the highlights of our report, and I'll save the sort of more juicy, detailed issues on hydrogen specifically for Paul Martin, who's the hydrogen expert here, who can take over and get into the details of hydrogen hype and the physics and the finances around that. But I'll kick it off quickly by just going through, I think, something a lot of you will be very familiar with, which is that gas is really not a bridge fuel. You know, the term natural gas is a marketing term for methane mixed with other hydrocarbons. So I'll just use gas for simplicity here. Gas is a primary cause of the climate crisis, and burning it is directly responsible for more than 22% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally at the moment, just from the combustion alone. The gas industry pretends that marginal emissions reduction from fuel switching from coal to gas somehow makes that a transition investment, but of course the opposite is true. And as I mentioned, the energy transition requires a systemic path to zero emissions as quickly as possible. So swapping one fossil fuel for another just doesn't solve the fundamental problem. We can't trade one polluting fuel for another and call that a solution. So any new investments made in supplying and burning gas just actually end up making it harder to complete the transition long term, effectively locking in high emissions for decades. Beyond just burning gas, the production and transportation of gas also generates significant climate pollution. Methane is a greenhouse gas that's far more powerful than CO2 with its warming potential. And warming from the estimated methane emissions from gas production alone on a 100-year time scale, back of the napkin, is about 800 million tons of CO2 annually equivalent. So that's higher than the emissions impact of the entire global aviation sector, just from the production of gas. And the numbers are probably much higher than that. That's just what's sort of reported. And of course, research now shows that the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of liquefied natural gas, LNG, which can be transported on ships by cooling it down into a liquid, is actually often significantly greater than that of coal, largely due to the significant leakage of methane during the production and transportation and liquefaction process. And of course, there's another problem with gas, which I really wanted to flag, which is anywhere that new investment in gas infrastructure is taking place, you will see that gas is competing against electrification with clean renewable energy. For making electricity, instead of replacing coal with gas, you could have built clean, secure renewable energy and storage projects, often at a lower cost. You're really locking in emissions and making a choice to block renewable energy development in many cases. And the same logic applies to heating buildings. Instead of putting in a new gas furnace or a boiler, we already have far cheaper, more efficient options readily available and drop-in technology like heat pumps to serve that role. So there's an opportunity cost in choosing gas. And we could obviously spend a whole webinar on heat pumps, and I suspect maybe the SEI initiative maybe has at some point. But bottom line is we have clean technologies, renewable energies, and heat pumps which can replace gas quite readily now. So we don't need gas as a bridge fuel any longer. I mentioned that the energy transition is well underway, and cheap renewable energy, electricity storage, heat pumps are already taking a big bite out of gas demand globally. So we're already seeing gas facing permanent structural decline any way you slice it. And this graph's taken from the International Energy Agency's most recent World Energy Outlook report, which is probably the most authoritative energy model you're likely to find at a global scale. And it shows 3 different outlooks out to 2050. Each has its own assumptions, so I'll quickly mention them. Steps, the one on the left there shows business as usual for fossil fuel demand, for energy demand globally, assuming only existing policies and trends. The second one, APS, also adds in announced policies and sort of promises that haven't yet been realized. And the net zero energy scenario on the right is the most important. It's a model of a potential future where we're successful in achieving the Paris Agreement goals. And that outlook is aligned with net zero goals. So what you're looking for gas there is purple. If you see the purple lines here, you will see a rapid decline or even a gentle decline, depending on which one you're looking at. And there's just 2 takeaways I wanted you to get from this. Gas is expected to peak and decline in all outlooks before 2030, and it doesn't recover. Renewable energy and electrification outcompete it even without new policies today. And the second thing I want you to take away is that we have to achieve our climate goals, which is this NZE on the right, shows what gas demand has to do in order to meet net zero by 2050 targets. So anyone who has adopted a net zero objective, including the government of Canada and most pension funds, should be planning for that right side pathway for climate success. In other words, we all need to be planning for the structural collapse of global gas demand, not investing in it. And here's what that collapse looks like, sort of closer up, looking at a specific gas utility. Industry analysts have warned about this phenomenon called the gas utility death spiral for some time now, and there's evidence that many utilities are in early or partway through stages of this already, including our own gas utility here in Ontario, Enbridge. And the death spiral sounds like dramatic language, but it's really just a feedback loop in which gas utility customers switch to electric appliances like heat pumps and induction stoves, like I've done myself in Toronto, powered by non-polluting energy sources, causing a decline in gas demand across the system. The utility has to cover the same fixed cost to deliver gas and maintain the system, but now it has to spread that across a smaller number of users. So they have to raise gas consumer delivery prices. And those higher prices drive more people to cut their gas lines and to go electric as well, thus driving even more utility customers to move away from gas until the utility model itself rapidly becomes unsustainable. And I do want to note, this is a phenomenon we're likely to see with gas utility models all over the world, and it does have very serious implications as well. It creates real equity problems. Not everyone can afford to buy a heat pump, or if you're a renter, you don't have control. So I just want to say there's a whole other side conversation about how to manage this from a policy perspective that's fascinating. But the bottom line for anybody who's a private investor in a gas utility is that you're looking at an almost certain path to losing money, and quite likely quite soon, because these technologies are already cost effective and being deployed at scale. This is a graph that's not going to be able to be very readable, but I just wanted to show you that it's there. As global gas demand faces permanent structural decline, gas utilities really don't have the opportunity to grow any longer. And gas infrastructure companies everywhere are likely to lose revenue and market value in the short to medium term. So this is a chart that just shows the ownership of Canadian pension funds that I mentioned in large privately held gas utilities around the world. Our pensions hold significant ownerships in 22 different gas companies with significant assets in gas transmission, distribution, power generation, storage, and processing. And combined, the pensions own nearly 350,000 kilometers of gas pipelines across their networks. And this doesn't include public utilities that are traded on market. So like Enbridge and TC Energy and Fortis, for example, are in addition to this. So we're talking about tens of billions of dollars in direct ownership of these networks. Will pensions be able to sell these assets for anything close to what they paid for them in a few years? Just a quick closer look, which you might be able to actually read. You can see some of the large ownership stakes that we've been tracking. At the top here, National Gas, which is the entire largest part of the UK's gas grid, is owned, about a quarter of it is owned by the BC pension manager, BCI. And Tallgrass Energy down here at the bottom is owned by Canada Pension Plan. So almost all of us are 1/4 owners of that gas utility. So this is tens of billions of dollars in stranded assets, potentially. And so the climate damage and the financial risks of gas are clear, but surely these big financial institutions ask hard questions about this. They must have some due diligence in place. And this is where we see a considerable amount of hydrogen hype, both from the companies, but also from the pension funds themselves. Nearly every one of those companies on that list tells a story about their own plan to use hydrogen to replace gas within their pipeline networks to keep their infrastructure viable and to avoid the death spiral. And this is a snapshot of the website of the UK utility National Gas I mentioned. This was split off from the company which owns the UK's electricity grid and sold for cheap to international investors. So I have to ask why they split this off in the first place. Did they see this risk coming themselves? 28% of it was bought by BC's public pension manager. So this is the pensions of public servants, teachers, nurses, professors. Now own this. And their whole story hangs on replacing gas with hydrogen for heating in the UK. And, the results on hydrogen heating as an idea are really back now. And I'll give this over to Paul to explain more in the details, but at a high level, hydrogen is just not a good solution for decarbonizing building heat in this way. There's a lot of physical constraints, there are efficiency losses, there are far higher costs for the overall system, higher carbon emissions, potentially safety concerns. There's a lot of reasons why that's not a practical or feasible thing to do. And you would have to really rebuild large parts of the gas infrastructure network if you hope to make it happen in the first place. And the supply of hydrogen itself is also a huge challenge, which I'm sure Paul can speak about as well, which opens a whole can of worms about issues like carbon capture and storage and other pieces. The electricity grid is already in place and it works well, and solutions like heat pumps are already being deployed directly. And so the need to do that kind of scale of transition doesn't make sense. But there's lots of pieces here, but I wanted to just focus your attention on this one paper published by Jan Rosno at the UK Regulatory Assistance Project, where he's reviewed 54 different studies studying the potential for hydrogen in home heating. And the conclusion is pretty blunt. Nobody recommends it. Not one of those studies recommends moving forward with it. There's quite a lot of work that's gone into that. And the harsh reality of this whole model is setting in the UK in particular. All of the UK's pilot projects for installing hydrogen boilers for heating homes and making hot water have failed so far. And the UK government, under the previous Conservative government, well before the last UK election, actually commissioned an update to their national infrastructure assessment, asking the question, is hydrogen for home heating feasible? And they came back with a definitive no in 2023. And the UK government has promised to update their whole strategy on this by 2026, where they will very likely cancel or recommend against hydrogen for home heating in the UK. And you can imagine those sorts of large-scale policy changes could really impact the value of these assets. And this is just a microcosm within the UK, but this sort of conversation is happening in countries around the world where pensions are invested as well, and it's happening in Canada. There are a lot of complicated pieces to get into for sort of why hydrogen can't save gas utilities from the death spiral. This is sort of a helpful image that shows this is from the clean energy analyst Michael Liebrick, who was founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And he's developed this graphic over time. This is version 5, and I'm sure it'll keep getting updated to help decision makers understand where hydrogen in the energy transition might make sense and where it's unlikely to be viable. And I'm sure maybe, Paul, you have thoughts on this as well, thought about this, but you can see hydrogen has some valuable uses in industrial processes and may play a role in some important but niche roles through decarbonization and the energy transition, but not in areas that could meaningfully reuse existing gas infrastructure at the scale required. And it's really not a viable option for decarbonizing home heating, transportation, or for power generation, which really makes up majority of global gas demand. Our report sort of ends with some case studies on individual pension investments, which you can look at in more detail. I'll share the link for the report in the chat, but we've also included some recommendations for institutional investors to avoid the climate impacts of gas infrastructure, but also their own financial exposure to it, to stop investing in new gas and hydrogen infrastructure, to increase their own transparency, disclose your investments fully and explain how they're actually transition aligned, acknowledge the need to decommission gas utilities over time. This has to be done carefully, and the best way to avoid stranded assets and losses is to start that process now, or at least thinking about it. And ultimately, to divest and screen from companies that refuse to align with science-based decarbonization pathways, for which most of these gas utilities, at least pure play gas utilities, are not at the moment. Yeah, and so I think I'll leave it there, but there's quite a bit more in the report in terms of detail, but I think the important sort of lesson is that these utility models are already facing very substantial risks, but the investment industry hasn't signaled that it really understands the scale of it. And so this is an effort to sort of shake up the sector to pay attention more closely to the details of the energy transition itself. If you understand the more technical aspects of the transition, you'll be able to avoid these risks in the future, and that's just better due diligence when it comes down to it. If you have, as individuals, want to get involved in helping to transition your own pension or to advocate for climate alignment with your pension and learn more, go to shiftaction.ca. That's our website, and you can find our research and you can take action directly. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Paul now, and if there are pieces we missed, we can catch up towards the end in the Q&A.
Thanks, Adam. And we've got, let's say, we'll have time for questions at the end as well. So I'll hand off to Paul.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thanks for your attention. Just to let you know a little bit about me, I am a chemical engineer. I've made and used hydrogen for decades, and I am also a co-founder of the Hydrogen Science Coalition. And if you want to find out more about HSC, you can go to h2sciencecoalition.com. Lots of good resources there that are public focused, and lots of deeper references if you are, or details if you want technical information. It's all provided from a position of that's free of financial interest. So hydrogen hydrogen is a decarbonization problem being sold as a decarbonization solution. It's actually a commodity chemical that has a market of about $180 billion per year worth as a chemical. Almost none of it is used as a fuel. 99% of it is made from fossils without carbon capture. It as a sector has GHG emissions that are around 4% of world GHG emissions. By my estimation, that's more than aviation and almost as much as aviation and shipping combined. Almost none of it is made by the on-purpose electrolysis of water using renewable or nuclear electricity, and almost all of it is made where it's used. Almost no hydrogen moves from place to place. There are exceptions, but the distances tend to be short and the quantity small, and that's for reasons. It's used as a chemical, as I mentioned. The largest uses are making ammonia, which is the base of the entire nitrogen chemicals industry on Earth, and also the base of the agricultural food chain, feeding about half of the humans and food animals on Earth by crop yield improvements. The other major use is desulfurizing fossils before we burn them. That's obviously going to be a curtailed use in a decarbonized future. And then the final third is a whole bunch of other chemicals uses. So of the 120 million tons or so per year that we make today in the form of pure hydrogen and syngas, about 90 of that will need to be replaced with renewable or low emitting sources of hydrogen in a decarbonized future. And then on top of it, we'll have to make whatever extra hydrogen we want to use for new uses. This is a graphic of the 5 principles of the Hydrogen Science Coalition. And these are just 5 things that we all agree on. We're a diverse group of people with a diverse backgrounds and interests and areas of specialization, but we all agree that really the only hydrogen that you can consider low GHG in realistic terms is green hydrogen, hydrogen made by electrolysis of water using renewable energy. We shouldn't allow hydrogen to delay electrification. So basically that writes off hydrogen as a fuel. Don't think of hydrogen as an energy export commodity because it's structurally unsuited to that task. We need to decarbonize the black hydrogen in the world, this 90 million tons that we need for use as a chemical. We have to do that first before thinking about new uses. And you really just give up on the notion of blending hydrogen into the natural gas network or using it as a natural gas replacement. And that'll be the subject of my focus today. If you want the peer-reviewed version of it, you can find the paper that I co-authored with several of my colleagues at HSE and also with Alyssa Acco and others at Environmental Defense. And you can find that in Energy Science and Engineering. And don't worry about the picture. It's just a picture for a nice graphic that Alyssa cooked up for the paper. You can find it in the paper. The paper's free access, so it's not behind a paywall. So hydrogen as a fossil gas replacement, you'll notice I'm using the word fossil gas as opposed to natural gas because natural gas is intended to distinguish it from synthetic gas, meaning gas made generally by pyrolysis or gasification of other materials. What we're talking about is what people call natural gas is largely a fossil material that's pulled out of the earth, and it contains primordial carbon that ends up in the atmosphere as CO2 that ends up raising the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. The notion that you can replace this fossil gas and the energy that we use from it with hydrogen is a popular but simple-minded concept. It's kind of a zombie meme idea. It's simple-minded. Its appeal is simple-minded, and it's so appealing that you'll never kill it. But it can't ever be alive for economic and technical reasons. It's largely, this notion of gas substitution is largely based on a sunk cost fallacy, which is we have the pipes and they're not going to be useful later, so let's use them for something productive. And in another sense, it's kind of the let them eat cake of the energy transition. So we can't burn fossils as fuels anymore. Well, what else can we burn? Well, we can burn hydrogen, and that way if we burn it in pure oxygen, we only get water, no CO2. So voila, problem solved. Well, only a few things wrong with that. We burn it in air and make NOx, and we can't afford it. So it really is the let them eat cake of the energy transition. The notion is supported by the gas industry, which doesn't want you to realize that their assets are really liabilities with an abandonment cost in a decarbonized context. And as mentioned, there are about 60 independent studies that agree that hydrogen is just not a practical alternative to fossil gas as an energy distribution medium. But what would it take if we were to want to do that for some reason? And I'll deal with that kind of zipping through here in the interest of time. But the first problem that you have is that it's pitched as if it's a continuous transition potential, that you can blend a little hydrogen and then a little more and a little more later, and eventually you can have pure hydrogen going through the pipes. The problem is that hydrogen's energy density per unit volume is a third that of methane. So it's really like adding water to gasoline. It might be good business if your customers are dumb and they pay for their fuel per unit volume. But the problem is it's like adding a diluent to your fuel stream, and that means you have to push more volume in order to push the same amount of energy. The other problem is that although 20% by volume sounds like a lot, that's the limit at which you start encountering real problems that we'll detail in future slides here. But that's only 7% in terms of energy content. So the maximum decarbonization potential of blending is next to nil. So if gas is a pathway to nowhere, a bridge to nowhere, hydrogen blending is the stepping stones to the bridge to nowhere, if you will. The other real problem is that even at a dreamland future cost of hydrogen, of decarbonized hydrogen of $3 a kilogram relative to about $1.50 a kilogram, which is what the black stuff costs at a zero cost of CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, a zero carbon tax basis. So even at a cost of $3 a kilogram, which is a dreamland future cost of hydrogen, that's still costing you $350 per ton of CO2 emissions averted. So you can imagine that if it's $6 per kilogram, and it might be 9 at the moment or higher, depending on where in the world you're talking about making it, you're talking about north of 700 to maybe even over $1,000 per ton of CO2 emissions averted. And at those sorts of costs, all sorts of things start to make sense. I mean, much less the sane, sensible decarbonization strategies of electrifying transport and electrifying comfort heating by means of heat pumps. I mean, those cost a tiny fraction of this, and yet, that's a dreamland future cost for hydrogen. The energetics are also really puzzling to anybody that studied thermodynamics. This is a nice graphic that Dr. David Sebon, who's one of my colleagues at HSC, put together, and it shows the comparative amount of wind energy that you would need to supply in order to provide 70 gigawatts of domestic heating in the UK. And if you do it by means of a hydrogen pathway, you're talking about 370 gigawatts of wind energy on the input side versus about 67 if you're feeding heat pumps. And the benefit of the heat pump, obviously, is that you're using the electricity for what it's good for. You're using it as thermodynamic work to run a pump that pumps heat, and that compensates for a lot of the extra costs and complexity. Whereas with hydrogen, you're doing the exact opposite. You're converting energy in the perfect form, electricity, which is readily convertible to any kind of energy that you want, heat or light or thermodynamic work or whatever you want. You're grinding up its exergy and you're turning it into heat in the form of a stored fuel, hydrogen, and then you're feeding it to combustion apparatus. And what you're left with is precious little energy. Now let's talk about the gas infrastructure. Well, gas infrastructure consists of a whole bunch of pieces. We're going to start closest to the well and go all the way to the consumer. So first of all, the gas gathering and gas plants, the stuff that basically connects the gas wells to the gas transmission network, that equipment is 100% scrap. It has salvage value as scrap, but that's it. And no, these people dreaming of finding large deposits of natural hydrogen in the subsurface, that's a totally different type of gas play. It needs different types of wells. The equipment in the gas plants is not suitable for that. So even if that turns into something, which my colleague Arnoud Everts at HSC will argue with you is probably not going to happen, the gas infrastructure upstream is scrap. The same with LNG facilities. LNG facilities are not convertible to pure hydrogen, and they're not convertible to ammonia either. This is a nonsense idea that has been pitched by people that even including Justin Trudeau at the G7 a few years ago. When I heard it, I spat coffee all over my computer screen. I just couldn't believe that this nonsense was being spoken aloud. The gases and their liquids have such utterly different physical and chemical properties and temperatures and pressures that there's just no possible way that you're going to use LNG infrastructure to store and distribute and deliver hydrogen across transoceanic distances. And trying to use it for ammonia is just wrong-headed. If you look at an ammonia plant, it already has liquefaction as part of the plant infrastructure because it's used as a way to get the product out of the gas mixture from which it's made. So there's no need for a separate liquefaction facility like there is with natural gas. So the most you're going to get out of an LNG facility in a decarbonized future is a port facility. You'll even have to demolish the tanks because the tanks are of the wrong construction. The big problem, though, with this gas substitution fantasy is the gas transmission system. This is a really technical topic, but I'll just make it nice and simple for you. You'll hear people talking about hydrogen embrittlement. That's a broad class of different phenomena that happen as a result of interactions between hydrogen and metallic materials. But the real problem in the gas transition infrastructure isn't hydrogen embrittlement per se. It's a very specific phenomenon called hydrogen-assisted fatigue cracking, or HAFC. When you use the hard, high-strength, high-yield strength, brittle pipes that they use to make natural gas high-pressure pipelines, the ones that carry gases long distances across countries, if you add hydrogen to those pipes, what you'll find is that the cracking rate in these materials increases by as much as a factor of 30, and the fracture toughness of the material drops by as much as 50%. And this happens with hydrogen blends, but it definitely happens with pure hydrogen. It's related to hydrogen partial pressure, but it's more complicated than that. There's a really excellent study by an organization called DVGW, which did excellent testing of materials and has demonstrated this to anyone's satisfaction that HAFC is a real thing and a real problem for gas infrastructure reuse with hydrogen. There are no approved coatings that can prevent this. So it's not a matter of putting a coating or a liner inside a pipe and eliminating this problem. There are people working on those sorts of solutions, but hydrogen is so diffusive, being such a small molecule, that based on my direct experience with hydrogen diffusing right through intact stainless steel in service, I don't think anyone's going to come up with a coating that eliminates this problem. New pipelines, however, if you want to build a new pipeline and use it for hydrogen, we know how to do that. That's not a problem. So we're really talking about reusing existing natural gas pipelines for gases that they were never designed to distribute. The real problem is that even though there are rules that will allow you to compensate for this accelerated cracking and other issues, and to reuse a gas pipeline that was never intended for hydrogen for use with hydrogen. The problem is that you have to drop the design pressure in order to make it adequately safe, in order to reduce the risk of fracture. And when you reduce design pressure, you reduce the economic delivery rate of energy. And this is an inescapable thing that arises from just dropping the pressure. But add to it the fact that hydrogen has this lower volumetric energy density, and you end up in real trouble. So you could try to run the compressors harder. You'd have to replace the compressors with new compressors in any case, but you could try to shove more gas through the pipe at a velocity that's not economic, but as it sounds, it will be uneconomic. You won't be able to afford to do it. And in reality, you're going to have to either accept a dramatically reduced energy delivery capacity in those transmission lines, or you're going to have to twin them with new pipe in order to carry the pure hydrogen in a separate new pipe anyway. And the end result is basically very limited reuse potential for the existing gas asset. Another thing that happens is that we use the stored energy in the pressure of the natural gas. So we pressurize the natural gas above a pressure, the minimum pressure that we need to use it at. And then we allow that pressure to drop during the day when we have high peaks of demand, and then we pressurize it back up again at night. And this storage is called line pack. And because the energy density of hydrogen per unit volume is greatly smaller than that of methane, the line pack drops by a third, even if the pressure doesn't drop. So, sorry, not by a third. It drops to 1/3 of what it was. So whereas you might have had 4 hours of storage, now you have a little over an hour of storage. And that storage is incredibly important to the reliability of the gas network. If a gas network ever encounters a low pressure trip, restarting can take weeks. It can take weeks. It's not a matter of flicking a breaker back on again. There are devices that have pilot lights that need to be relit. And if they're not relit, the device will be unsafe and it'll leak hydrogen, for instance, into a home or a business. So this is a big deal. And the same thing is true. We use natural gas reservoirs as storage for fossil gas right now. We build up the storage in the summer for use in the winter. And you can't do that with hydrogen because the hydrogen, it won't be pure hydrogen when it comes back, and there'll be a lot less of it than what you fed. It's possible to build new storage infrastructure in gas, salt dome gas storage units that are constructed for the purpose of storing hydrogen, but you'd have to construct those. You can't use the old ones. The gas distribution system is really not a huge problem. Okay, the gas distribution infrastructure that carries gas to individual homes and businesses, that's all mild steel or HDPE pipe. It'll leak, that'll be troublesome, but the real problems of HAFC and other embrittlement phenomena are not a problem there. The real trouble is what use is the gas distribution infrastructure if there's no gas transmission infrastructure to feed it. So the problem with hydrogen isn't in the distribution side, it's in the transmission side. The other real problem with hydrogen is in leakage and fire risk. And hydrogen has a lot of really unpleasant properties that we know how to handle in industry, in industrial settings, but in a commercial or consumer context, they're very troubling. And if we get time at the end, I'll show this video, but I won't do it now. It's just showing the differences in flame propagation rate among various gases, with hydrogen being extremely fast. Hydrogen's got a lower ignition energy. It's got a much wider explosive range. So if you have a mixture of hydrogen and air, it's almost certain that you will have a mixture that will be ignitable. The flame velocity means that you get higher overpressures, which lead to more damage. And yeah, anyway, there's a long list I could bore you with, but it's a much more dangerous gas. We know how to handle it industrially safely, but we make a lot of compromises and expend a lot of money to do so. It is much more dangerous than natural gas. This has been proven in quantitative risk assessments that were done for some of these hydrogen utilization trials in the UK. They concluded that they needed to add excess flow devices in order to reduce the size of explosions that happen, because they couldn't reduce the number of explosions. The number of explosions would increase by a factor of 4, switching the gases. So in order to make the risk, which is the probability times the severity, low enough, they had to reduce the severity by adding these excess flow devices. Now, if you added the excess flow devices to the natural gas system, that would reduce the natural gas hazard as well. And so that's kind of a dumb comparison. And of course, the explosion risk with heat pumps is 0. So that's the reference technology. End-use devices with hydrogen beyond about 20% need total replacement. That means engines, turbines, gas burners. It's not a matter of changing a jet inside a gas burner. It's a totally different type of gas. You need a different burner management system, different flame detection systems, and the hazards are not small here. So end-use devices would have to be totally replaced. This is not a matter of simple modification. From a toxicological perspective, when you get rid of natural gas, you get rid of carbon monoxide. So if you had pure hydrogen, you wouldn't have any carbon monoxide risk anymore. That would be great. The problem is that when you burn anything in air, you heat up nitrogen and oxygen. They react with one another to make NOx. This happens with hydrogen just as it does when you burn anything else, wood, gasoline, natural gas, it doesn't matter. So NOx in the home is already a major contributing cause of childhood asthma. So, and the reference technology, again, heat pumps, has no risk. So what are we doing here? So in the interest of time, I've had to rush through things, and I refer you to my other publications, and I'm happy to answer questions. But just to sum up with some conclusions here, low greenhouse gas emission hydrogen won't be a significant gas replacement due to its cost, which is structurally high. It's not going to get cheaper with innovation to the point where it will be cheap enough to waste as a fuel, and its low greenhouse gas or global warming potential reduction potential. The upstream natural gas and LNG infrastructure are toast. The transmission network is under capacity and might be reusable to some extent, but not relevant to energy, only to chemicals use. The transmission pipelines would have to be twinned anyway, because not all distribution networks will be ready with all the devices converted to pure hydrogen service at the same time. The gas distribution network itself is really not a huge issue, but without a transmission network to feed it, it's useless anyway. And the end use devices would have to be either totally replaced or substantially modified to run with pure hydrogen. So what's really going on here? The renewable electricity generators are in trouble because we don't want to build grids to allow them to carry their product to customers who want it. And as a consequence, they're reaching around for anything and trying to find something that they can convert electricity into to make money that they can ship. And they're reaching around for hydrogen and hydrogen-derived molecules out of desperation. The gas industry wants to pretend that they have a business post decarbonization, and biogas methane will never cut it. I mean, we'll never be able to make anywhere nearly enough biogas methane to match anything close to the amount of energy they're delivering now. So it's hydrogen or nothing. Sell hydrogen door to door or nothing. Hydrogen represents a predatory delay strategy and a distraction from real decarbonization of the energy system. That is fundamentally what's going on here. Only a small amount of energy in the form of hydrogen can be moved in the existing gas network, and at considerable public cost. The investment by pension funds in this has been made on the wrong thesis, in my opinion. And the real problems of hydrogen transmission and distribution drive even dumber ideas, like converting hydrogen into hydrogen-derived molecules, like ammonia, methanol, liquid organic hydrogen carriers, and the like, which, in order to solve the problem of hydrogen's structurally poor properties as a fuel, waste even more energy in order to make it more effective. In other words, to make it easier to move and store. And making methane from its combustion products, making hydrogen from water using electricity and reacting that with carbon dioxide to make methane to use as a fuel is just the dumbest of the dumb. It's stupid with stupid sauce. And with that, I'll leave you with my lovely little meme. It's this simple. If people are talking about making hydrogen where the grid is still dirty, that's not green hydrogen. If they're talking about wasting hydrogen as a fuel, forget it. But green hydrogen to replace black hydrogen, that's really what we should be talking about. And I'll leave you with the link here. Go to spitfireresearch.com or my LinkedIn profile, or to the h2sciencecoalition.com website, and you can get more information.
Great. Thanks, Paul. This is all very interesting, somewhat sobering for some, perhaps. I'm going to open the floor to questions. We've got some in the chat, but also want to see if anybody wants to use the raise hand function and ask an actual question of our presenters directly. So I've got, I'll go with what's in the chat then for now and see if somebody's inspired. So one that came up immediately from a couple people is this question about e-gas, which there seems to be some interest in Quebec.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, maybe we explain what this is. Yeah, and explain what it is, and then where does this fit in terms of overcoming the technical limits of putting hydrogen into gas pipelines?
Absolutely. So this e-gas is the notion that I talked about. So the idea is it's hard to move hydrogen in the natural gas network for the reasons that I explained. So what you would do instead is you would take CO2. Now, it would have to be CO2 from a biogenic source. So something that has recently been in the atmosphere, so that such that when you burn the gas at the end, you're returning biogenic CO2 to the atmosphere. Although the proponents are often talking about using fossil gas derived CO2 for this purpose. You then take that CO2 and react it with hydrogen to make methane and water. And then you put the methane in the natural gas network and replace it. And the problem with this, Joanne Whitmore and I, Joanne's on the call, she's a colleague of mine in HSC. We did an evaluation of a project in Quebec that's being put forward by a company called TES, Tree Energy Systems, which would take $14 to $18 per gigajoule pristine, beautiful Quebec hydroelectricity and convert it into $40 to $90 per gigajoule heat. Now, who wants to sign up for that one? And by the way, we didn't know the cost of certain pieces of equipment in that process, so we assumed they were free. And we were still coming up with prices on that order. So this is a nonsense idea being put forward by people in Tree Energy Systems. They have an LNG terminal that they just purchased in Ludwigshafen, and they want to have a plausible opportunity to reuse that infrastructure, and so that's why they're pushing this e-gas notion.
Interesting. Yeah, it seemed potentially quite uneconomic. Question for Adam here, and about the pitch to pension managers, or how they're reacting in terms of their overall investment strategy. Do they see them as making sense as public equity, private equity, or direct investments? So is the nature of how are they investing? And then secondly, while it's clear how divesting from gas investments makes sense from on the simple basis of risk return, what about pension funds who have dual mandates like the KES and maybe others, not only deliver best safe returns, but also build the economy? This would be very relevant to the KES. Does the dual mandate make them more or less receptive to your pitch?
Two very good questions. So for the first one, yeah, the way that pensions, the reason we focus so much on the private equity side of the equation, just wanted to flag this, is that pension funds, they have big portfolios and they have different risk return profiles for different parts, different buckets. And so they have, when it comes to, big chunks of their portfolio, they want like nice, stable, long-term returns, and they'll often put that into a infrastructure. So that's why this sort of infrastructure is appealing in that part of their private equity part of their portfolio, is it's relatively safe and it provides stable returns on a regulated basis. That's the theory, but it's illiquid. In other words, they can't sell it quickly. It's not an open market. They actually have to find a buyer. It could take years to sell something. And so that's why traditionally they've held gas utilities in that part of their portfolio. And that's why it's so risky, is that is a very long-term buy and hold part of the portfolio in particular. Pension funds like to invest 10-year plus horizons. And if they're in an illiquid market, they may not be able to find a buyer if they decide suddenly today, maybe they watched this presentation today and they went, oh, wow, this really is a substantial financial risk for us. It's going to take a long time to get rid of it. Whereas on the public equity side, they can trade on a daily or a quarterly basis if they want to buy low, sell high. And so they have a totally different approach to the risk there. I think the companies have a very similar risk profile, but the types of investments differ. So I hope that made some sense to you. But I just will also say our pension funds in Canada have huge private equity portfolios, especially on the infrastructure side. So the scale of what we're talking about is often much bigger over there. On the dual mandate question for the CDPQ, really interesting question. I mean, in this area, I think their mandate to promote the Quebec economy would be much better focused on electricity. Quebec's economy is very much the clean electricity economy globally. They're the largest, sort of wealthiest per capita owners of clean electricity infrastructure in the world in Quebec, and Hydro-Quebec is publicly owned. and investing in the sort of clean electrification of their economy is very much in line with the best long-term interest financially of the province. Taking clean electricity, as Paul suggested, and turning it into really expensive heat doesn't, all that's going to do is damage the economy, and it's unlikely to be successful financially either. So when you look at these dead end pathways, when you think more systemically about the direction of the energy transition and how we have to get to zero, it makes sense to come to these decisions as early as possible. And they're difficult, but to say Énergir's network, of which CDPQ is a major owner, I think they own 90% of the Quebec utility Énergir, it's not going to collapse overnight, but they really have to think carefully about how they're going to unwind that asset and get their returns from it now, or else they're very much at risk of the whole thing collapsing on them and wiping out billions of dollars worth of value and people's jobs. But if you buy into this sort of false hope of hydrogen or other false solutions that will keep that network alive, you're maybe blind to that reality and more likely to step off the cliff. So this is just about being realistic and honest about where we are and what technologies are available.
And the other thing that I think is really important to add to Adam's point is that, the argument that I hear constantly that seems compelling unless you actually know enough about it to draw another conclusion is that, technologies get cheaper. It's early days with hydrogen as a fuel. Technologies get cheaper, therefore it might be expensive now, but look at wind and solar, they got cheaper, batteries got cheaper, so therefore hydrogen will get cheaper. And the problem with that notion is that they're ignoring the fact that hydrogen is a commodity chemical with a $180 billion a year market. We've been working on it for a long time, and the way that Wright's Law, which is this process of learning and getting better at things and hence dropping cost, the way that Wright's Law works requires doublings of production. And the problem with electrolysis in particular as a clean way to make hydrogen is that half of its capital cost right now is for stuff that has no Wright's Law learning potential at all. I've got a long article about this. Is what I do for a living, by the way. I'm a chemical process development specialist. I work at the interface between people developing new chemical process technology and its industrialization. So piloting new technologies, helping them make the right decisions about where to put their effort and their energy, making sure they're measuring the right things and that their techno-economics are going to line up and they'll have a business at the end of the day. And when you look at it from a techno-economic perspective, it's very easy to understand why green hydrogen's cost won't follow these sorts of Wright's Law learnings that many of the proponents want you to believe that they will. And again, I've made an extensive argument along those lines on the basis of my knowledge in this area, and I encourage you to read it. You can find it either on spitfireresearch.com or on my LinkedIn profile. But the point here is that it's structurally expensive in ways that innovation cannot fix. And that's the difference. You see, if something is expensive because we haven't done much of it, then subsidy to prime the pump, so to speak, might help. But if something is structurally expensive, what you need to do is you need to put in place policy measures that make the dirty thing that's cheap right now more expensive so that the cleaner but more expensive thing can compete. We don't like doing that, though, because that sounds like paying more money for the same thing. So we want the magic of technology to solve this for us. And unfortunately, that's not going to work out with hydrogen as a fuel.
This is an interesting set of questions, and the next question actually raises this because it's this larger issue of technology assessment in public policy that we seem to have, there's sort of an enthusiasm on the part of governments for what we're essentially saying start to look like dead ends. And I think the question behind that is, it's phrased here from our participant: does the government have sufficient knowledge on the science of hydrogen, and are they receptive to scientific advice? And it all seems a larger question, though, because this isn't unique to this technology. There are others around which lots of questions exist, and yet there's lots of investment happening. Like is part of the problem here how governments are going about making decisions about these technological pathways and not necessarily paying attention to certain physical and chemical realities which may underlie them.
Yeah, it's even worse than that, I would say, Mark, that what's really going on is that you have proponents who come at this either from a position of a straightforward vested interest, so somebody who has a hydrogen company that wants to sell hydrogen to people, or somebody that wants to sell hydrogen related equipment, they have an obvious conflict of interest in offering opinions about the future of hydrogen for subsidy, putting it forward as something that should be subsidized or something that might be a decarbonization solution. But the bigger problem actually are less those people than the ones who are in what I would call a position of moral hazard. And so a perfect example of that is an engineering consultancy. So an engineering consultancy, and I've worked for companies like that before, and in fact, I worked for a pilot plant company that was kind of in the very definition of a moral hazard. Anytime a customer came to us and said, "Hey, should we build a pilot plant?" I would say, "Dude, you're asking somebody who makes hammers whether or not you need a hammer. I'm the wrong person to ask." So the people that are in a position of moral hazard benefit from our attempt by, making money, having a salary, doing a study, whatever. And they do not benefit if we don't make the attempt. And it's these people who are pushing us to do things that are obvious dead ends. And back at my former employer, we used to jokingly call such projects biofuels projects of the second kind. So a biofuels project of the first kind is very straightforward. They want to take wood chips and make gasoline out of it, as an example. But a biofuels project of the second kind takes a different biomass input. They take large amounts of paper money as their biomass input, and they produce a product called salaries. And that's the trouble, that if you allow this kind of tail to wag the governmental dog, you get bad public policy. And, as it turns out, our Minister of Natural Resources, I presume Wilkinson is still in that position, and who knows what will happen in a month or so. But Wilkinson is a former vice president of a gasifier company. He thinks hydrogen is the best thing since sliced bread. So, is that a conflict of interest? I don't think so. I think it's just a bias, or something that should make people wonder whether or not he's biased. But anyway, he certainly has a very positive attitude towards hydrogen, funds lots of hydrogen related stuff. And I think that arises from past work experience on his part.
I just want to follow that up and say,
Yeah.
completely agree. And it's underestimated just how much of the difficulty in the energy transition is because of the political power of incumbency. Honestly, the technologies have been there to do electrification for a long time now. We have all the tools mostly we need to solve the bigger issues, and we can't move on them because of this entanglement and in some cases corruption. On the policy side in particular, I gave an example of the UK. They created a policy to try to build these huge hydrogen mainline pipelines, and it was a whole infrastructure strategy, and that was at the behest of industry pushing them. So their lobby was very effective. And then 5 years later, less than 5 years later, when the bureaucrats actually did the work, they went, "Oh, none of this is doable. This isn't real." And now they're going to have to back away from it. So they listened to the lobbyists without doing the diligence. The investors have done the same thing. They listen to the companies. They have, and a lot of these investors, frankly, have fossil fuel executives or other directors on their own boards. And so they're inclined to sort of go along to get along without disrupting anything. And fundamentally, the energy transition involves a lot of very difficult decisions. Phasing out our gas pipeline network is not an easy thing to do. It's going to be very expensive and painful, but it has to be done. But it's really easy to press the snooze button, It's just too easy to say.
I'll give you a related but beautifully exemplary example. We all know that we need to electrify GO Transit here in Ontario, right? For those of you who don't know what GO Transit is these are the trains that carry people from the suburbs of Toronto into Toronto and in the greater Toronto region. Electrifying it is a multi-tens of billions of dollar project. It will take decades to do. We should have gotten started on it a decade ago. It would have actually saved us money had we done so, but we chose not to because it's very expensive and nobody wants to bite the bullet. So what did we do instead? Metrolinx, the organization that's now responsible for GO Transit, did a study, 4 years, $7 million, looking at using hydrogen locomotives instead of electrification. And the project was a brilliant success. For the low cost of $7 million, they delayed electrification by 4 years. Now, I could have told them for $5, or whatever, a cup of coffee, that hydrogen locomotives were stupid and would never make any sense, especially in a place where we've got the beautiful hydro and nuclear resources that we have in Ontario, such a low carbon intensity grid. It would be mad to do anything other than electrification, perhaps with batteries to make the jumping wires through tunnels and overpasses and that sort of thing a cheaper option. But that wasn't the objective. The objective was delaying electrification, and it was a brilliant success.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in Adam's comment too about you sometimes think that the investment community is supposed to be less subject to those political influences in terms of the rationality of its decision making, and you're kind of implying that's not the case. That it's equally vulnerable to being effectively lobbied, for lack of a better way of putting it. Another question here, and this is slightly different, but this is from Rohan, who's one of our MESJD students. Just asking back to the gas grid infrastructure, and I think Ryan, intervene if I'm not understanding this correctly, but kind of asking, are there other purposes to which we could adapt the gas infrastructure? You're mentioning geothermal here. Is there some other purpose, given this infrastructure exists, is there something else useful that could be done with it other than running fossil gas through it?
Yeah,
Well,
just thinking of like enhanced geothermal, because I know there are a couple of Canadian projects like the Evo Loop, and then a couple other companies that are working on adapting gas infrastructure to EGS. Of course, that requires, I guess, implementation, and especially if you're doing district energy system. But yeah, just want to know your thoughts on that.
Sure. So the gas distribution system between homes and businesses, the pipes are way too small to carry energy in any form other than that as a fuel. So forget about using the existing natural gas distribution infrastructure for carrying heat in the form of hot water, for instance, in a district heating system. The pipes are also not insulated, so they're not ideal for that purpose. But yeah, volumetrically, they're not just too small; they're too small by like perhaps an order of magnitude. As far as Evor, what those guys are doing is they're planning to use the technology that has been used by the upstream natural gas and oil people in order to develop geothermal energy projects. That shows some promise, but it's not a redeployment or reuse of the existing natural gas infrastructure. It's a reuse of natural gas and oil upstream technology. So it's not like anybody's going to be taking a natural gas pipeline, converting it to hot water, and thinking for a moment that it carries even a tiny fraction as much energy in the form of hot water as it did in the form of natural gas.
So this does look more and more like a stranded asset at the end of the day.
Well, no, in fact, the gas industry knows that their transmission pipes are themselves a stranded asset, and when they talk about reusing the infrastructure, they're talking about reusing the right of way. Because the right of way is the thing that's extremely valuable. And so what they'll do is they'll just run a new pipe alongside the existing one if we're dumb enough to pay 10 times as much per joule for hydrogen as we do for natural gas. That's the redeployment that they're hoping to do, because they know they'll need to do that anyway for the reasons that I mentioned, because of the capacity limitations of the existing pipes.
So it's the right of way. In some ways, it's valuable, and the access that goes with that less than.
Oh yeah, that's extremely valuable. And you could run HVDC cables, for instance, down those same rights of way. That would be extremely valuable and would be aligned with decarbonization. It would make wonderful sense if you have production and consumption at the right places to make use of that right of way, right? So, but of course, the energy it's just like the natural hydrogen thing. It's not necessarily found in the right places. So you may end up with pipes that would be, or rights of way that are worthwhile, useful, but they run to the wrong places. So they might not be useful after all.
Rohan, a quick follow-up, and then I think we're on to our last question then.
Yeah. So thank you for answering my question. Just want to know, I guess, because I know you said the existing infrastructure isn't available. Like, is that just, I guess, is that just piping? Because I know there is the like the Alberta has it, the Rainbow Lake one, which they say will upgrade like, temperatures of some existing oil and gas aquifers and upgrade other oil and gas infrastructure. So I guess. Um, so like when companies say, they can use existing oil and gas infrastructure, I guess what are your thoughts on that?
So now you're talking about reservoirs. I'm
Yeah.
I'm, I'm talking about pipes. The pipes are
You're
just
you're just talking about pipes here. Okay.
yeah, and I think that anybody that's talking about trying to use the thermal energy in existing oil and gas reservoirs for geothermal probably needs to pay more attention to what Evor is actually planning to do. That's not my understanding of what they're trying to do. They're trying to drill into the subsurface in places where they'll get a better return of heat for their purposes, because again their strategy isn't district heating, it's largely it's electrical production as far as I understand it, which is I mean that's a hard road to hoe, honestly. It's
Right.
very challenging to make money doing that. So I wish them very best of luck. I hope that they're successful, but yeah, it's not going to be a reuse of natural gas pipelines.
Right. Okay, great.
Okay, thank you. A final question here, is the clock's becoming our enemy a bit, and which is asking about design of an effective carbon pricing or taxation system on black hydrogen with the intention of promoting green hydrogen. So it's a policy design. You're trying to work against
Sure.
black and towards green hydrogen. What might that look like?
Well, I'd look at it another way. And what I would say is that governments shouldn't be picking technological winners and losers at all. What they should be doing is they should be putting in place policy measures that make emissions cost money, and then letting using regulatory tools after the taxes have done the heavy lifting in order to trim emissions that become recalcitrant, at really high costs per ton of CO2 emissions averted. And they should also be putting in place regulations that avoid the cheating, the kind of gaming of the system that invariably creative, wealth motivated people engage in order to game a system, in order to take financial advantage from it. So what we shouldn't be doing is saying, well, we really need to get rid of this black hydrogen and replace it with green. What we should be doing is saying we need to eliminate these greenhouse gas emissions at the lowest cost per ton of CO2 emissions averted that we possibly can, as quickly and as practically as we can. How can we best do that? It's not anything to do with hydrogen. Hydrogen's a fourth tier emissions thing to worry about, because the cost per ton averted is really high. It's north of $300 a ton. So let's work on electrifying transport and heating first, because those can be done at between -50 for my electric vehicle, for instance. Its cost of operation is lower than the gasoline vehicle that it replaces, and the cost to me of emissions aversion is negative, to say $100 a ton for a home heat pump. We should be doing that stuff first, because that stuff's cheap and we can get cheap GHG emissions and worry about this $300 a ton shit in 2040 or 2050. That's what we should do. That, in my opinion. I'm not a policy person, I'm an engineer. But that's what I would do if somebody, foolishly decided to make me emperor. I would try to be benevolent, but that's how I would do it. I'd say, look, emissions need to be expensive. They're going to get expensive steadily, more and more every year. Nobody gets any exemptions. Nobody gets any way to cheat it. And just make the emissions go away. And if they don't go away, I'm going to regulate them away.
Let the price signal do its work.
Let the
And-
price signal
and
do
we'll-
as much work as it can, realizing that prices are elastic, or demand is elastic to some degree, and or is it inelastic? I always get the two reversed. And then use regulation as a scalpel rather than a battle axe to trim the recalcitrant emissions that happen despite high costs. And sometimes those situations will need further policy support, like northern remote and rural transport. You're not going to be using hydrogen or electric vehicles to resupply First Nations communities in northern Ontario, or where they have to slide across ice roads or things like that. Fuel logistics kill both of those options. So guess what? They're going to need to use liquid fuels, and those are going to be very expensive. So they're going to need some policy support to help them afford them.
Yeah.
It's the reality of the situation.
Thank you. Well, on that note, which brings us back to carbon pricing, but we'll have to save that one for another day. I want to thank both our speakers, Adam and Paul. This has been incredibly informative and very, very useful. We will be posting the video of this shortly, and just as the sort of up to channel update. We're thinking about our next couple of possibilities in terms of webinars. One on what's going on in Saskatchewan. We have a former PhD student from EUC, Brett Dolter at University of Regina, will speak at that. And then there has been some discussion of whether we should have a conversation about Canada's role in nuclear in Australia. And I've got to loop back on that one because there's a whole interesting story going on there as well. But for now, I want to thank both of our speakers and thank everybody for their participation as well. As I say, this has been an incredibly useful and informative conversation. I hope everybody found that to be the same. So thank you very much, and we'll wrap there.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
you
you.
all.
Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. I'm going to end the meeting. There we go.